He thought he could humiliate her in front of 200 students and walk away applauded. But by the end of that hour, the only thing echoing through the lecture hall would be the sound of his own silence. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe dignity always finds its way back to the surface, stay with this story. Now, back to Claire Bennett. The Calculus Symposium at Weston University was standing room only that Thursday afternoon, the kind of event where graduate students lined the walls and visiting scholars filled the front rows, notebooks open, phones ready to capture whatever brilliance Professor Lucas Harding decided to unveil. Harding was the pride of the department, a published authority with a polished resume, a tailored navy suit, and a reputation for dismantling arguments with the ease of someone swatting dust from a chalkboard. He thrived on admiration, and even more on control. Claire Bennett moved quietly along the side aisle, a slim folder tucked against her cardigan, her low heels barely making a sound against the polished wood floor. At 40, she blended seamlessly into the background of the mathematics building, known to most as the department secretary who scheduled meetings, organized grant paperwork, and refilled the faculty lounge coffee before anyone noticed it was empty. Her light brown hair was pulled back neatly, her expression composed, her presence almost invisible by design. Harding noticed her only because she paused near the back row, listening as he began outlining a complex proof tied to his latest research submission. The room leaned forward as he filled the board with integrals and transformations, his voice smooth and confident. "This," he said, underlining a key step, "is where lesser mathematicians get lost." A few students chuckled obediently. Claire's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not in offense, but in recognition. There was a subtle misstep in the transition from one variable to another, a detail so fine most would miss it, but not someone who had lived and breathed this language long before she ever typed up meeting minutes. Harding caught sight of her stillness and misread it as confusion. His lips curved into a thin smile. "Ms. Bennett," he called out, projecting his voice toward the back, "since you seem particularly engaged, perhaps you'd like to solve the next step for us. Just for fun." The laughter came quickly, light and dismissive, the sound of young minds certain they were witnessing harmless entertainment. Claire felt every eye turn toward her, felt the weight of assumption settle over her shoulders. Harding extended a piece of chalk toward her with theatrical courtesy. "Take your time," he added, his tone gentle enough to pass for kindness, sharp enough to carry condescension. He believed this would be a harmless spectacle, a moment to reinforce the hierarchy he carefully maintained. What he did not see was the quiet steadiness in Claire's gaze as she stepped forward, nor the history folded inside the unremarkable cardigan she wore. The lecture hall lights hummed softly overhead, dust particles drifting through the beam above the chalkboard, as she accepted the chalk without a word. And for the first time that afternoon, the room began to shift in a way no one yet understood. Claire did not rush, and she did not hesitate. She studied the line Professor Harding had underlined, the transition he had described with such certainty, and for a brief second she allowed herself to remember the last time she had stood at a board like this, not as an assistant, but as a researcher presenting to a room of peers who spoke the same language of limits and proofs. The chalk felt lighter than she expected as she lifted it, and when she began to write, her hand moved with quiet precision. She rewrote the previous line, isolating the variable, adjusting the transformation with a subtle correction that only someone deeply fluent in advanced calculus would even consider. A faint murmur traveled through the room. Harding shifted his weight, the confident smile still fixed on his face, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Claire continued, simplifying the expression step by step, her movements economical, no wasted symbols, no dramatic pauses. The fluorescent lights reflected softly off the board as the equation began to resolve into something cleaner, more elegant than before. A graduate student in the second row leaned forward, flipping through his notes, trying to follow her reasoning. Another stopped typing altogether. Harding cleared his throat. "Remember, Ms. Bennett, this is a highly specialized approach," he said, the hint of warning wrapped in academic politeness. Claire did not turn around. "Yes, Professor," she replied calmly, her voice steady, respectful, and completely unshaken. She moved to the next line, applying a substitution Harding had overlooked. one that eliminated the instability in his earlier step. The effect was immediate. The complexity that had filled half the board began collapsing into a concise, coherent structure. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even the students who had laughed moments earlier were now watching in silence, their earlier amusement replaced by confusion, then concentration. Claire paused only once, stepping back just enough to scan the entire progression, ensuring each transformation aligned perfectly. Then she wrote the final expression, boxed it neatly, and set the chalk down on the tray with a soft click that echoed more loudly than it should have. She turned toward the class, not with triumph, but with composure. The boundary condition stabilizes if you apply the substitution before integrating, she explained gently. Otherwise, the error compounds in the final step. Harding stared at the board. His eyes moved from the top line to the bottom, retracing her work, searching for a flaw, a miscalculation, anything that would restore the balance of power he had expected to maintain. He found none. A visiting scholar in the front row adjusted his glasses and nodded almost imperceptibly. Someone in the back whispered, "That is actually cleaner." The whisper spread like a ripple. Harding picked up a piece of chalk himself and approached the board, erasing a small section of his original proof, comparing it to hers. The air felt heavier now, charged not with laughter, but with realization. Claire stood quietly beside the board, hands folded in front of her, her cardigan sleeve dusted faintly with white chalk. She did not look at Harding. She did not look at the students. She simply waited. And in that waiting, something shifted permanently in the room. Professor Harding remained at the board longer than necessary, tracing Claire's solution with the tip of his chalk as though pressure alone might reveal a hidden flaw. The silence in the lecture hall no longer felt curious or amused. It felt evaluative. 200 eyes shifted between the equations and the man who had built his reputation on mastering them. Harding straightened his shoulders and forced a thin smile. "An interesting alternative," he said carefully, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. "However, this theorem extends beyond basic substitutions." He turned back to the board and wrote a new expression beneath Claire's boxed result, one drawn directly from his unpublished manuscript, dense with notation few outside his research circle had ever seen. "Perhaps you would like to address this extension as well, Miss Bennett." A faint edge returned to his tone, an attempt to reclaim authority. The students held their breath. Claire studied the new sequence quietly. The symbols were complex, layered with assumptions embedded between lines. She recognized them immediately, not because she had skimmed the abstract, but because she had once helped draft the foundational model years ago under a different institution, before life had shifted her path away from lecture halls and into administrative offices. She stepped forward again without theatrics. Her voice remained even. "The instability here," she said gently, pointing to a coefficient in the third line, "originates from the same misordered transformation." Harding's jaw tightened. "Proceed," he replied. Claire rewrote the first two lines, rearranging the structure with calm precision, then applied a limiting argument that simplified the entire extension into a coherent continuation of her earlier result. The chalk moved steadily, the sound rhythmic against the board. Students began flipping pages frantically, trying to keep up. A visiting professor in the front row whispered to his colleague, eyes widening slightly. Claire completed the derivation and circled the final term, showing how the extended proof resolved cleanly once the foundational error was corrected. When she stepped back, there was no flourish, no dramatic pause, just quiet certainty. Harding approached the board again, scanning every symbol. The color had drained subtly from his face. "Where did you study this approach?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier mockery. Claire folded her hands lightly. "Stanford," she replied. "Doctorate in applied mathematics. My dissertation focused on nonlinear stability in multivariable systems." A collective intake of breath swept across the hall. A student near the aisle muttered, "She has a doctorate?" Claire continued calmly. "I left academia 12 years ago after my husband passed. I needed something stable for my son. This position was available." The words landed without self-pity, without drama, simply stated. Harding stared at her as though recalculating everything he believed he knew. The hierarchy he had assumed was quietly dismantling itself in front of him. The lecture hall, once filled with laughter, now held a different kind of weight, the weight of recognition. Respect had shifted, not with applause, but with understanding. And for the first time that afternoon, Professor Harding had nothing left to correct. The silence did not break with applause. It settled instead into something far more unsettling for Professor Harding. A quiet recalibration happening in the minds of every student seated in that hall. He placed the chalk down slowly, as if sudden movement might fracture what remained of his authority. "Why?" he began, his voice measured but no longer commanding. "Are you working in administrative support if you hold a doctorate in applied mathematics?" The question carried less accusation now and more disbelief. Claire met his gaze without challenge. "Because stability matters," she answered softly. "After my husband passed, I needed predictable hours. Health insurance. Something that allowed me to raise my son without traveling to conferences every other week." A few students exchanged glances, their earlier laughter now a source of visible discomfort. Harding shifted his stance, the polished confidence he wore like a second jacket beginning to loosen at the seams. "You never considered returning?" he asked. Claire glanced briefly at the board, at the clean structure of the proof that now stood as quiet testimony. "Mathematics does not leave you," she said, "even when you leave the institution." The statement lingered in the air, simple and undeniable. A visiting scholar near the front cleared his throat. "Her correction aligns with a concern I had reviewing your preprint," he said carefully, directing his words toward Harding. "The instability in Section 4 appears resolved in her framework." The comment was polite, but its implication was unmistakable. Harding inhaled slowly. For years he had controlled rooms like this with precision, guiding thought, anticipating critique, shaping perception. Now perception was reshaping him. He turned back to Claire. "Would you be willing," he said after a long pause, "to walk us through your full derivation next week?" The request landed differently than the challenge he had issued earlier. It was not a test. It was an invitation. Claire considered the room, the rows of students who had witnessed her dismissal and her demonstration in the same hour. "If it would benefit them," she replied, nodding toward the class. A faint ripple of approval moved through the seats. Harding gave a single nod, the closest he could come to acknowledgment without explicitly surrendering pride. "Very well," he said. Class dismissed. Chairs shifted, notebooks closed, but no one rushed for the exits. Several students approached Claire instead, tentative at first. "Your substitution method," one began. "Could you recommend a paper where I can study that?" Another simply said, "I am sorry." Claire answered each question with patience, her voice calm, never indulgent, never resentful. Harding stood at the edge of the platform, watching as the center of gravity in his own lecture hall shifted quietly toward the woman he had intended to embarrass. The fluorescent lights hummed as they always had, the equations still bright against the dark board. Nothing physical had changed, yet something fundamental had. Authority had been measured not by volume or title, but by clarity and humility. And as the last of the students filtered out, Professor Harding remained standing beside the board, staring at the corrected proof, fully aware that the most powerful lesson taught that afternoon had not been his. The lecture hall emptied slowly, but the echo of that afternoon did not fade with the footsteps. By evening, the story had already begun circulating through faculty offices and student group chats, not exaggerated, not distorted, simply repeated with one consistent detail. The department secretary had corrected the department's most celebrated professor in front of 200 witnesses. Claire returned to her small office on the second floor, the one with the humming printer and the narrow window overlooking the parking lot. She set her folder down, wiped the faint trace of chalk from her sleeve, and opened her email as she always did. There were budget forms to finalize, a faculty meeting to reschedule, and a reminder about maintenance in the West Wing. Ordinary tasks. Predictable tasks. The kind that had anchored her life for over a decade. Her phone vibrated softly against the desk. A message from her son. How did the lecture go? She smiled. He had grown up watching her solve equations at the kitchen table after dinner, long after she had put away the idea of returning to academia. It was their quiet ritual. She typed back, "It went well. I think you would have enjoyed it." Across campus, Professor Harding sat alone in his office, the printed draft of his manuscript open on his desk. The correction Claire had made was clear now, undeniable in its logic. What unsettled him most was not the error itself, but the ease with which she had seen it. He had built his career on precision, on being the sharpest mind in the room. That afternoon, the room had chosen differently. The following Monday, the lecture hall filled again, this time with a different energy. Word had spread beyond the mathematics department. Claire stood at the front, not as an assistant but as a scholar, a fresh board behind her, the fluorescent lights steady overhead. Professor Harding sat in the front row, hands folded, listening. She walked the class through the full derivation with clarity and patience, pausing to explain each transformation, not to impress, but to illuminate. Students asked questions freely. She answered without condescension. When she finished, the applause came naturally, not explosive, but sincere. Harding rose slowly. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett," he said, using her title without hesitation. The acknowledgment was simple, but it carried weight. Claire nodded. "We all miss things," she replied gently. "That is why collaboration matters." The statement was not a rebuke. It was an invitation to humility. In the weeks that followed, Claire was offered a visiting lecturer position, flexible hours, structured around her family's needs. She accepted, not for prestige, but because it allowed her to teach without sacrificing the stability she had fought to protect. Students often said her classes felt different, less about proving intelligence and more about discovering it. Professor Harding adjusted as well. His lectures grew less theatrical, more careful. He cited her correction in his revised paper. And every so often, when he caught himself underestimating someone based on appearance alone, he remembered the quiet sound of chalk against the board and the moment the room shifted. Because that day had not been about humiliation. It had been about clarity. And clarity, once revealed, does not return quietly to the shadows. Autumn settled over Weston University with a quiet certainty. The maple trees along the main quad turning shades of amber and red as students hurried between classes with coffee cups warming their hands against the crisp air. Claire Bennett adjusted the strap of her leather satchel as she crossed the courtyard, no longer invisible, but still composed in the same simple cardigans and modest flats she had always worn. Her visiting lecturer position had become a permanent part of her schedule, 2 courses a week, each one filled beyond capacity. Word had spread that her classroom felt different, that questions were welcomed, that mistakes were explored rather than exposed. Inside room 204, the whiteboard was already clean when she arrived. She preferred to start with empty space. As students filed in, there was no nervous laughter, no side glances. There was anticipation. Claire began the lecture not with equations, but with a story about how small assumptions can distort entire systems if left unchecked. She wrote a simple limit expression on the board and asked the class what they noticed. Hands rose immediately. Discussion unfolded naturally. When a student hesitated mid-explanation, she did not interrupt. She waited. The silence felt safe, not threatening. Down the hall, Professor Harding paused outside her classroom for a moment, hearing the low hum of engaged conversation. Months earlier, he would have dismissed it as theatrics. Now he recognized something he had neglected for years: intellectual humility. He returned to his office and revised his syllabus again, removing a section that relied more on intimidation than insight. Later that afternoon, Claire sat in her small office reviewing student papers when there was a soft knock at her door. It was the graduate student who had once laughed the loudest during that first lecture. He stood awkwardly, holding a marked-up draft. "I wanted to thank you," he said, voice steady but sincere. "You made me realize I was measuring intelligence by volume." Claire smiled gently. "Volume fades," she replied. "Clarity remains." He nodded and left, the lesson settling deeper than any formula. That evening, Claire returned home to a modest 2-bedroom house just 15 minutes from campus. She set her satchel on the kitchen counter where her son was finishing homework at the table. "How was class?" he asked, the same question he had asked for years. She poured 2 glasses of water and sat beside him. "Challenging," she said with a quiet laugh. "In the best way." Through the window, the last light of day filtered across the yard, steady and unremarkable. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic declarations across campus. Just gradual change. Professor Harding began inviting junior faculty to critique his work before publication. Students spoke up more freely in seminars. The mathematics department, once defined by prestige alone, began to value collaboration as much as competition. And every so often, When Claire picked up a piece of chalk and felt its familiar weight between her fingers, she remembered that afternoon when laughter had filled the room. She did not remember it with resentment. She remembered it as the moment the equation corrected more than a proof. It corrected perspective. Because in the end, the most complex variables are not written on a board. They are written in the assumptions people make about one another. And once those assumptions are simplified, the solution becomes remarkably clear. Winter arrived quietly at Weston University, coating the edges of the campus lawns with a thin layer of frost that sparkled under the early morning sun. Claire Bennett stepped into her classroom with a stack of graded exams balanced carefully in her arms, the familiar scent of dry erase markers and old textbooks greeting her like an old friend. The room filled gradually, students shaking snow from their coats, laughter softer now, more thoughtful. Something fundamental had shifted over the semester, not just in how they viewed her, but in how they viewed one another. Claire set the exams on the desk and turned to the board, writing a single question across the top in steady letters. What do you assume before you calculate? The class fell into attentive silence. It was no longer the tense quiet of uncertainty, but the focused stillness of minds ready to engage. She walked them through a complex optimization problem, one that required patience more than speed. When a student made an error midway through the solution, she did not correct him immediately. Instead, she asked the room what they noticed. Hands rose. Discussion unfolded. The correction came not from authority, but from collaboration. Across campus, Professor Harding prepared for a faculty symposium, reviewing his slides with deliberate care. The sharp edges in his tone had softened over the months. He no longer began lectures with statements designed to intimidate. He began with questions. That afternoon, during the symposium, he referenced a methodological adjustment that had strengthened his latest publication. Credit for this refinement, he said clearly into the microphone, goes to Dr. Claire Bennett. The acknowledgment was simple, but it carried through the auditorium like a recalibrated constant. Faculty members nodded. A few even smiled. Later, as snow began to fall more steadily, Claire gathered her belongings and stepped outside into the cold evening air. The campus lights glowed warmly against the gray sky. A group of first-year students passed by, deep in conversation about a proof she had assigned. One of them paused. "Professor Bennett," she called out, "I think I finally understand why the substitution matters." Claire smiled. "Understanding always matters more than speed," she replied. The student nodded thoughtfully and hurried off. At home that night, Claire sat at the kitchen table with her son, reviewing his college applications. He looked up at her, thoughtful. "Did it bother you?" he asked gently. "The way he treated you that first day?" Claire considered the question carefully. "It taught me something," she answered. "Not about calculus. About assumptions." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. People reveal themselves when they think they are in control. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering sidewalks, rooftops, and parked cars in equal measure. It did not discriminate. It simply settled, quiet and even. Months earlier, laughter had echoed through a lecture hall at her expense. Now her name was spoken with respect in classrooms and conference rooms alike. She had not demanded it. She had demonstrated it. And in doing so, she had rewritten more than an equation. She had reminded an entire department that intelligence does not announce itself with volume or title. It reveals itself in clarity, patience, and quiet strength. And once revealed, it changes the room forever. Spring returned to Weston University with a steady warmth that melted the last traces of winter from the stone walkways and filled the air with the scent of fresh-cut grass. The campus looked different in the sunlight, brighter, almost reflective, as if the months behind it had quietly reshaped more than the landscape. Claire Bennett stood at the front of the largest lecture hall on campus, not because she had sought it, but because enrollment in her courses had tripled. Students sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, laptops glowing softly in the afternoon light. She wrote a complex multivariable system across the board, her handwriting steady and unhurried. "Look beyond the first impression," she said calmly. "The structure reveals itself when you are patient." The words were mathematical in context, but everyone in the room understood their broader meaning. In the back row sat Professor Harding, invited by the department chair to observe the evolution of the curriculum. He no longer occupied the center of the stage. He observed quietly, occasionally taking notes, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. When a student asked a question challenging one of Claire's assumptions, she smiled. "That is a good question," she replied. "Let us test it." She handed the marker to the student and stepped aside. The room watched as the young woman worked through the alternative approach. When a small inconsistency appeared in the third step, Claire guided her gently, not correcting her, but asking, "What happens if you apply the transformation earlier?" The student's eyes widened as she saw it. The class murmured in appreciation, not of spectacle, but of discovery. Later that afternoon, the department hosted an open forum for prospective students and faculty. The dean introduced Claire as a key figure in reshaping the culture of the mathematics program. There was no dramatic applause, only respectful acknowledgment. Harding stepped forward during the discussion period. "I once believed expertise was proven by dominance," he admitted evenly. "I was wrong." The room grew still. Clarity and humility build stronger proofs than pride ever will. He turned slightly toward Claire, offering a small nod that carried more sincerity than any formal apology could have expressed. She returned the nod, not triumphant, not vindictive, simply steady. The semester closed with record participation and collaborative research projects emerging between students who might never have spoken under the old hierarchy. Claire walked across campus that evening as the sun dipped low over the brick buildings, casting long shadows that stretched evenly across the quad. A group of freshmen passed her, debating an optimization problem with animated enthusiasm. None of them mentioned status or titles. They spoke about ideas. She paused briefly near the steps of the mathematics building, looking up at the windows where she had once stood unnoticed. Nothing about her appearance had changed. The same modest clothes. The same quiet demeanor. What had changed was perception. The equation had balanced itself, not through confrontation, but through demonstration. And as the golden light faded into dusk, the campus carried on, unaware that one of its most important lessons had never been written in a textbook. It had been written in the silence that followed laughter, in the courage to step forward, and in the grace to respond without bitterness. And that lesson, once learned, did not disappear with the semester. It settled into the culture, steady and enduring, like a proof that holds under every condition. Graduation day arrived beneath a wide blue sky, the kind that stretched endlessly above the stadium where rows of white chairs lined the freshly cut grass. In precise symmetry, families filled the bleachers, cameras ready, programs folded neatly in their laps. Claire Bennett sat among the faculty on the platform, her robe simple, her expression composed, sunlight catching softly in her hair. Years earlier she had sat in another stadium receiving her own doctorate, full of ambition and certainty about the path ahead. Life had rewritten that path, but it had not erased the knowledge she carried. As the dean began calling names, applause rose and fell in waves across the field. Claire watched her students cross the stage, each one representing not just academic achievement, but growth born from a culture that no longer confused intimidation with excellence. When the final graduates shook hands and the ceremony neared its close, the dean stepped back to the podium. "Before we conclude," he said, adjusting the microphone, "we would like to recognize a faculty member whose influence this year has reshaped our department in ways that will last far beyond this class." A murmur moved through the crowd. Claire felt a quiet awareness, but remained still. "Dr. Claire Bennett," the dean continued, "has reminded us that brilliance does not need to announce itself. It needs only to be demonstrated." The applause that followed was not thunderous or dramatic. It was steady, sustained, sincere. Claire rose and walked to the podium, the grass beneath her shoes firm and even. She did not look overwhelmed. She looked grounded. "Mathematics," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the stadium, "is not about proving someone else wrong. It is about seeking what is true." The breeze lifted the edge of her robe slightly as she continued. "And truth requires humility. It requires the willingness to examine your assumptions before you calculate your conclusions." In the front row of faculty, Professor Harding listened with quiet focus, his hands folded. There was no resentment in his posture, only reflection. Claire paused briefly, scanning the sea of graduates in their caps and gowns. "You will walk into rooms where people underestimate you," she said gently. and you will walk into rooms where you are tempted to underestimate others. Remember that intelligence often arrives quietly. The stadium fell still. Even the distant hum of traffic beyond campus seemed to soften. Let your work speak, she finished, and let your character echo. She stepped back from the microphone as the applause rose again, warmer this time, layered with understanding. Later, as families embraced and photographs were taken against the backdrop of red brick buildings, Claire stood at the edge of the field beside her son, who now towered slightly above her. "You changed more than a department," he said softly. She smiled and looked out across the campus, sunlight glinting off classroom windows where equations would be written again in the fall. "I did not change it," she replied. "I corrected a small error." The wind moved gently through the stadium, carrying laughter, conversation, and the quiet promise of futures unfolding. And in that open sky above Weston University, there was no trace of the laughter that had once filled a lecture hall at her expense. There was only clarity, because in the end, the most powerful proofs are not written in chalk. They are written in how we choose to see one another. In that day, the world remembered exactly what dignity looks like.